Last time on Virus Wars. On a trip to Africa, little Timmy contracted schistosomiasis. But you shouldn't feel bad for him, since he was voted most likely in his class to become a flat earther conspiracist when he grows up. Now, he travels the world, trying to make it home, like a lost puppy. How did he end up in Africa in the first place? Where are his parents, or any responsible adult, really? What horrible infectious disease will he encounter today? Find out the answer to that last question this time on Virus Wars.
Well, according to this map, I should be close to home by now. Wow, Florida is way snowier than I remember it.
You're not in Florida, Timmy.
I mean, my map says Florida.
It's upside down.
Oh.
You're in Siberia.
Oh no.
And I'm a ghost.
Oh no.
A ghost of a deer, deceased 100 years now, but ejected from the permafrost by unseasonably warm weather. I was laid low by a horrible curse, the curse of anthrax, and now I haunt little children and give them anthrax too, in order to satisfy my bloodlust. Come play with me, Timmy. Little did Timmy know that there are no such things as ghosts, and in fact, it's just me, the host of Virus Wars, putting on a voice. Also, the story of a child contracting anthrax after playing with a century-old deer corpse appears to be urban legend, as far as I can determine. But that story does tie into a very real outbreak of anthrax in Siberia in 2016. What is anthrax? Why should you be scared of it? Should you be scared of it? Let's find out, this time, on Virus Wars. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Virus Wars, the show where I talk about bacteria. That's the joke. That's the joke. Get it? Because the name is Virus Wars, but I say I talk about bacteria, and they're different. It's funny. Okay. But today I actually am talking about bacteria and the disease that they cause. The bacteria in question are Bacillus anthracis and Bacillus cereus biovar anthracis, and the disease is called anthrax. But before that, let's have a word from our sponsor, Artificial Intelligence. Because why do anything when you can have a computer do it for you? So let me just pull this up and typity. Anthrax, the bad boy bacteria of the microbial world. Ladies and gentlemen, hey, I use ladies and gentlemen. Bacteria enthusiasts and hypochondriacs alike gather around for the wild, wacky, and slightly terrifying tale of anthrax. The bacterium that puts the yikes in microbial menagerie. Bad boy bacteria that just won't quit. Blah blah blah, like a microbial Cinderella story, except there is no fairy godmother and a lot more potential for causing disease. Jesus. Powdered anthrax spores mailed to media and government offices. That's hilarious. It still has a few tricks up its sleeves. It's not at all about bioterrorism. Okay. Always ready to cause a ruckus. Maybe think twice before opening any suspicious letters. Jesus Christ. Okay. Alright, okay, that reads like the least interesting person on the planet maybe hit his head and also fell down a pit filled with cocaine and undeserved self-confidence. Never mind. Cancel the AI sponsorship. I guess I am doing this myself. Alright, Timmy, let's pretend we are a couple of field biologists going on an adventure. Yes, an adventure. Let's grab our shovel and our electron microscope and dig up some of this soil.
I really don't want anything to do with this.
I said, dig. Great! Now when we examine the soil, we're going to find something that looks a little bit like this. Now, I really envy the engineering people. They get cool explosions and things catching fire dramatically. We get things that look like this. But believe it or not, those are one of the deadliest things known to man, the spores of the bacterium Bacillus anthracis. Now, a quick bacterial rundown before we proceed. Bacterium is a single-celled life form, although they can grow in colonies and clumps or in a way where the cells are physically attached to each other. They have a protective wall on the outside of the cell and have a very simple organization inside the cell without any specialized compartments. Bacteria live all around you, and most aren't harmful at all. We call this category non-pathogenic. Some bacteria happily live in the environment, but will infect a human or animal host when given the chance. These are opportunistic pathogens. Bacillus anthracis is neither of these. It needs to infect an animal host to reproduce, and thus is the rarest and nastiest type of pathogen, the obligate pathogen. As with every life cycle, we need a place to start, so we're going to start here in the soil where the anthrax spores live, or rather, sleep. Right now, these bacteria are completely dormant. Protected by a thick proteinaceous shell is a highly dehydrated core of bacterial DNA and basic machinery, currently completely metabolically inactive. And hardy. Spores can survive in the soil for decades, and, as a bit of foreshadowing for a future discussion, they're incredibly hard to kill. So they just sleep in the soil, frozen in time, until some grazing animal comes along and roots around, eating grass and shrubbery and the sweet, sweet dirt along with the anthrax spores. Now, before I get into what happens next, I do have to preface that most studies done on anthrax infection are done in mice, monkeys, or using human cells in culture. And when I'm explaining the life cycle in grazing animals, I need to make the assumption that everything we know about how the bacterium infects people is true for animals too. In this case, it's a pretty safe assumption, but there's your caveat. So, the animal eats grass in areas of high soil anthrax contamination, and then things get complicated. What we do know is that the spores need to enter their new host. This could happen 1. Through abrasions in the skin or soft tissue of the mouth, 2. Inside of the gastrointestinal tract, or potentially 3. Through inhalation of spores after contaminated soil is disturbed. Let's talk about scenario 1 as a general case example. The anthrax spore gets through the skin or mucous barrier of the animal and gets lodged inside the tissue. This, as it turns out, is a nice, warm, welcoming environment with the right temperature, acidity, moisture, and nutrient content to make the spore very happy, and it begins to change into its vegetative, that is, its growing form. Now, most of the nutrients anthrax needs are readily available just freely sloshing around the body, except for iron. Fortunately for anthrax, animals have plenty of iron inside them. Unfortunately for anthrax, all of that iron is attached to a pesky protein called hemoglobin, which red blood cells use to shuttle oxygen around the body. But anthrax has a solution to that problem in the form of the proteins called ISDX1 and ISDX2. These proteins, which anthrax secretes into the environment, can enter red blood cells and literally rip the iron-containing heme group off of the hemoglobin proteins. And then anthrax can absorb and eat it. The other thing that anthrax needs to do is survive the attack of the body's immune system, which doesn't like random bacteria coming in, dividing, and eating all of its nutrients. One way it does this is by building a nice strong capsule that protects it against degradation and direct attack by immune system proteins. But anthrax doesn't just play the defensive game. In fact, its strategy is primarily offensive. The key agent of this strategy, the thing it's best known for, and the thing that makes anthrax so deadly, is its toxin. Oh, what's that? An immune cell wants to raise the alarm? Kill it. An immune cell wants to secrete a whole bunch of toxic compounds all over you? Kill it. An immune cell ate you and now wants to digest you into tiny little fragments? Call it stupid and ugly and tell it that it will never amount to anything, and then kill it. I'll get to how the toxin works later, but for now you should know that it's also an important part of how anthrax spreads. You see, there are a bunch of small little organs called lymph nodes scattered all throughout the body, and they're a hangout spot for your immune cells where they can talk to each other and share information. So when certain kinds of immune cells see a bacterium in the wild, they think, huh, I should eat this thing, digest it, and take it back to the lymph node to tell my friends all about it. So when an immune cell eats the anthrax bacterium, it starts a battle between the immune cell, which is trying to digest it, and the anthrax, which is trying to kill that immune cell before it is digested, using its anthrax toxin. Sometimes anthrax wins and sometimes it loses, but eventually it's going to get carried to a lymph node and establish infection there, from which point it will get pushed out with the lymphatic fluid into the bloodstream and go systemic. Going back a little, this is how the lung and gastrointestinal infection routes work. Instead of entering the tissue through abrasions, the spores get picked up by surveilling immune cells and mature as they're being carried to the nearest lymph nodes from the lungs, or specialized lymph node-like areas called Peyer's patches in the gut. Both of these routes are faster and deadlier for the infected host because there is less time and less steps from bacterial entry to systemic spread. So now anthrax is in the blood, and we're almost done with this section, and the animal is almost done with its remaining life. The anthrax bacteria in the bloodstream will continue to make anthrax toxin, which will eventually kill the animal. The only other player in this drama is the humble mosquito, or this thing. Oh god, this thing. They can drink the blood of infected animals and spread the disease to other animals, particularly if the animals are in close proximity, such as in a herd. As the animals get sick and start to die off, anthrax bacteria can sense the changes in their environment and begin to transform, packing all of their important components back into spores, which will leach back into the soil from infected animal blood and tissue as it decays. There they will sit and wait quietly for decades, waiting to infect their next host. And could it be you? No. The chance of you getting anthrax from soil exposure is on par with being struck by lightning, then winning the lottery, then being struck by lightning a second time, for good measure. But a small amount of people do get infected with anthrax every year, mostly through contact with infected animals and contaminated animal products. So, let's talk about what goes down if it happens to you. Spoilers, it's not pleasant. Now, if you've been paying attention, you have been paying attention, haven't you, Timmy? Oh, for fuck's sake. What was I saying again? What anthrax, the disease, will look like in you will depend on how you get infected by the anthrax bacterium. The potential routes are skin contact, consumption, inhalation, and injection. Skin contact is the most common, though you need some abrasions or cuts in the skin for the anthrax spores to actually get in. This happens when people handle infected animals or hides or animal products from infected animals. Apart from being the most common form of anthrax disease seen in people, this form is the least deadly, killing you only 25% of the time if left untreated. A few days after exposure, a boil forms at the infection site and the surrounding tissue starts to swell. The boil and the flesh underneath erode into an ulcer with a black center, with angry red tissue surrounding it. Strangely enough, this process is largely painless, though it definitely looks gnarly. After this, one of two things happen. Either your immune system finally gets its act together and eliminates all the bacteria while they are still localized to the initial site of infection, or the anthrax spreads to the lymph nodes, then the blood, becomes systemic, and eliminates you. And this is a great place for a tangent, because to understand how anthrax actually does what it does from a medical perspective, we need to talk about anthrax toxin. I explained before that anthrax uses its toxin to attack and destroy immune cells, but what I failed to mention at the time is that anthrax toxin also attacks and destroys the rest of you as well. This could be because anthrax is one of those rare pathogens that actually wants to kill its host, because host death is part of its life cycle. But that's just speculation. So let's look at how the toxin works and what it does. Well, first, anthrax toxin is made up of 3 proteins: protective antigen, lethal factor, and edema factor. They are collectively called anthrax toxin, but in reality they combine together to make 2 distinct toxins: lethal toxin and edema toxin. Protective antigen is the common factor between these 2 toxins. Either before or after being secreted from the anthrax bacterium, protective antigen binds either lethal factor or edema factor, and then it floats around until it can find a cell, carrying lethal factor and edema factor along with it. Once there are enough protective antigen proteins stuck to a cell, they assemble into exodia. They assemble into a pre-pore complex, which is a ring of 6 protective antigen proteins with their attached lethal/edema factor proteins. This tickles the cell a little, causing the cell to swallow the ring into a little compartmentalized cellular stomach called the endosome, which begins to fill with acid. The acid causes the ring to expand, forming a hole in the endosome through which the edema factor or the lethal factor can escape into the cell itself and wreak havoc. Edema factor starts making a bunch of the signaling molecule cyclic AMP, which helps shut down immune signals and also makes the cell swell with fluid. When this affects many cells in a tissue, it causes the tissue to swell, which is called edema, hence edema factor. Can you guess what lethal factor does? Well, it inhibits mitogen-activated protein kinase signaling, which eventually kills the cell, hence lethal factor. So why the tangent? Because this is what makes anthrax so lethal. It is not the bacteria themselves that kill you, it's the toxin. And in cases where anthrax makes it into the bloodstream and starts pumping out a ton of this toxin, eliminating the bacteria alone with, say, antibiotics won't save you anymore because the toxin is still around, destroying your body from within. The precise mechanism of how it actually does this is a matter of some contention. Lethal factor causes direct damage to cells and organs, potentially including the heart itself. Edema factor causes massive tissue swelling. The end result is circulatory system collapse, an extreme case of shock when there isn't enough fluid in the blood vessels and the heart is too weak to be able to effectively pump blood and deliver oxygen from your lungs to your organs. This results in organ death and brain death, similar to what you see with blood loss, except all the fluid stays inside your body, it just gets transferred around to the wrong compartments. So, with science out of the way, it's time for, you guessed it, more science. So let's go back to the different ways you can get anthrax. We talked about skin exposure, and now let's talk about ingestion. If anthrax spores are consumed, say in raw or insufficiently cooked meat or other animal product, you typically get one of two types of disease: oropharyngeal or gastrointestinal. Oropharyngeal anthrax is what happens when anthrax spores enter through abrasions in the mouth and start growing locally, leading to tissue destruction at the site of infection, followed by severe swelling of your face and your throat area. After that, you have lymph node spread, systemic spread, and death. Gastrointestinal anthrax happens when the spores make it to the intestine and are carried by surveilling immune cells into specialized lymph node-like areas called Peyer's patches. It starts off looking like a bad case of food poisoning with nausea, vomiting, fever, and diarrhea, possibly bloody, but progresses rapidly to intestinal destruction and systemic illness. For the purpose of statistics, oropharyngeal and gastrointestinal anthrax are frequently lumped into one gastrointestinal category, but clinically they are quite distinct, with oropharyngeal being more common and also almost always survivable with prompt diagnosis and treatment, and proper gastrointestinal anthrax being far more dangerous, with a far smaller window between when symptoms appear and when it's too late to treat. So that's what happens when you eat anthrax. What happens when you inject it into yourself? Well, first of all, don't do that. Don't do that. And second of all, there are relatively few examples to draw from, but the consensus is that it looks a lot like the skin form of the disease, but since the spores are lodged deeper, it can spread to the blood faster, which makes it a faster and more lethal form of the skin type anthrax. And finally, we get to inhalation anthrax, which you can get by breathing in spores while working with, say, the wool and the hides of infected animals. It's also kind of like that meme I've seen the children use, because by the time you start feeling sick, you're already dead. Like I already discussed, the spores don't stay in your lungs, but get carried to lymph nodes all around the lungs, of which there are a ton. For the first few days, you might have a mild fever or not feel anything at all. But when the anthrax bacteria and their toxins reach critical mass, the tissue around your lungs dies rapidly and fluid starts leaking to the chest cavity, which causes pain and trouble breathing. By this point, the disease is untreatable, with a bit of an asterisk there, we'll talk about it later, but considered untreatable since even if all of the bacteria are eliminated, there's now enough toxin in your system to kill you. So how do you treat anthrax? Well, penicillin. Penicillin works. That's an antibiotic, and other antibiotics work too. Here's a list. And the key, if you've been paying attention, no, Put that down. Put that down. The key, if you have been paying attention, is to give it early before the toxin builds up in your system. In the case of a possible exposure, early prophylactic antibiotics can guarantee you stay disease-free. But what happens if you get fulminant gastrointestinal or inhalation anthrax and don't realize it, and now you're dying? Well, there may possibly be hope for you yet. Possibly. Thanks to recent developments in monoclonal antibody technology, there are now antibody drugs that specifically neutralize anthrax toxin by targeting protective antigen and stopping the toxin from entering your cells. Does it work? I don't know. They work in experimental animal models, but if they have ever been used in the clinic or on actual people infected with anthrax, I cannot find those results. But hey, if you could go sniff some anthrax for all of us, maybe you can be the first to find out. You know, for science. For science. Do it for science. Fun facts. Let's do some fun facts. Fun fact 1. Anthrax is a gram-positive bacterium. Yay! It's always good to stay gram-positive. Fun fact 2. Anthrax is historically important. It was discovered by Robert Koch in 1876 and was the first bacterium to definitively be shown to cause disease, leading to an explosive boom in microbiology and medicine. Koch and his work are interesting enough to have a whole video on, to me, anyway. But the next time you find yourself alive and not dead of the plague, thank anthrax. Thank you, anthrax. Fun fact 3! So, back to anthrax toxin. Edema factor causes edema, and lethal factor causes lethal, both quite significant status debuffs, but protective antigen must be called that because it protects them, right? Wrong. It's called protective antigen because it protects you, kind of. Vaccines usually target a specific part of a pathogen that is necessary to shut down its virulence or pathogenicity. And in the case of anthrax, it's protective antigen because it's the critical functional component of its toxin. Yes, there are vaccines, and while it varies country by country, they are generally given only to people who work with animals, people who work with anthrax, and quote-unquote select military personnel, which does not sound ominous at all. Fun fact 4! So there's this other bacterium called Bacillus cereus, right? Abbreviated to B. cereus, so it holds a special niche in the Venn diagram of microbiology jokes and dad jokes. It's very similar to Bacillus anthracis and very closely evolutionarily related as well. It lives and grows in the soil and is mostly harmless, but a long time ago, an ancestor of Bacillus cereus somehow picked up some extra DNA. Bacteria do this a lot, grabbing DNA from each other, the environment, or even other bacterial species. And this DNA usually comes in the form of plasmids, or little circles of DNA carrying some extra genes. And in this case, these plasmids turn the harmless Proto-Bacillus cereus into the pathogenic Bacillus anthracis. And these plasmids are still there, just floating around. Take them away, and Bacillus anthracis becomes completely harmless. Alternatively, give them to Bacillus cereus, and you get something called Bacillus cereus biovar anthracis, which starts to behave just like normal anthrax. Wild. Fun fact 5! When I type quickly, I tend to type anthrax as anterhax. I've done this probably over 100 times while writing the script, and it is absolutely maddening. So, wow. Also wild. Fun fact 6. Cutaneous anterhax. Yeah, no, I actually did it again. Not even joking. Gives you a gnarly black scar at the center of the infection that is dark as coal. That's where the word anthrax comes from. It's related to the Greek word for coal. Those were some fun facts, but let's talk about something else. Anthrax is found in the soil everywhere, all over the world. The WHO estimates roughly 2,000 natural human cases of anthrax happen every year. And these cases can pop up just about anywhere, but the biggest outbreaks tend to happen around hotspots, or specific geographic areas where, for generations, animals have been periodically getting infected and dying, thus reinforcing anthrax spore concentrations in the soil. The most recent large outbreak happened in Zambia in 2023, with 684 suspected cases and 4 deaths reported. This followed a 2011 outbreak, also in Zambia, with close to 500 suspected cases. Unfortunately, both of these outbreaks are relatively poorly documented, but the last very well documented outbreak among people happened right here in Siberia. So let's take a quick look and see if we can gain some useful information. God damn it, Mr. Kitty. No, yes, I love you too. Yes, just fucking stop. I'm sitting on my keyboard. Yes, sit on my lap. Sit on my lap instead. Thank you. Now, you may have read on Wikipedia or some pop science articles that a child caught anthrax and perished after interacting with a deer corpse, thawed from the permafrost after 75 years during an unseasonably warm summer. I could not actually find any credible evidence for this story. While it is absolutely possible to get anthrax from interacting with the carcass of an infected animal, and it is possible for spores to survive for 75 years, especially if they spend time frozen, that doesn't seem to be what happened. What actually seems to have happened is that some animals in a deer herd belonging to a local community of deer herders got sick with anthrax. It was, in fact, an unseasonably warm summer, which could have affected populations of blood-sucking insects, enabling anthrax spread. It could also have contributed to higher concentrations of anthrax spores in the soil, melting out of the permafrost, though this is a hypothesis not yet backed by hard evidence. What it definitely did contribute to was the misidentification of anthrax illness as heat stroke or heat exhaustion, and the illness raged among local deer for 2 to 3 weeks, with sick deer being butchered for industry under the presumption of safety before the first human cases occurred. In total, close to 2.5 thousand deer and 36 people were infected, 10 of whom were children under the age of 14. Of those people who had time to develop symptoms before treatment, 21 developed cutaneous anthrax, 11 developed oropharyngeal anthrax, and 1 individual developed fulminant gastrointestinal anthrax, from which they perished. Most of these skin infections happened after handling and butchering sick animals, whereas the oropharyngeal and gastrointestinal infections happened from eating raw meat and raw blood products from sick animals. Following all of this, there were massive quarantine and contamination efforts, but with this outbreak, as well as other outbreaks that have been documented, there are some commonalities. The first and most crucial is the lack of expert veterinary support to identify and confirm anthrax in sick animals. The second is the lack of domestic animal vaccination programs in hotspots. The third is the butchering of sick animals for meat and products, which is a bad idea regardless of the nature of the illness. This typically happens in poorer and/or more traditional communities that depend on every animal for their livelihood, so that's 4. These communities typically use traditional, involved, low-tech, or otherwise unorthodox methods of butchering, and may consume meat and animal products without cooking or by using methods of food preparation that do not effectively kill spores. And that's 5. Ultimately, measures to monitor and prevent animal and human infection vary from country to country depending on incidence rates, available resources, and political will. Concerted efforts to decontaminate known geographical hotspots can gradually reduce incidence in problem areas, in theory, but this is expensive and hard. Oh, but speaking of political will, let's talk about the ultimate expression of political will, war. So now the problem with talking about bioweapons programs is that they are a teensy bit classified. I don't have any special dirt on anyone, and reading publicly available speculation about this or that nation's bioweapons development program after reading scientific literature is like stepping out of a book club discussion on James Joyce's Ulysses directly into a scene of 2 chimps screaming and howling and throwing shit at each other. So I won't even try to cover the history of anthrax weaponization. However, we can say with some certainty that all of the major players in World War II on both sides weaponized anthrax with some degree of success. And it makes sense. Anthrax has a lot of qualities that make it a desirable bioweapon candidate. First, it's easy to grow. Second, it's incredibly durable and metabolically inactive in its spore form, making it easy to transport and package into a weapon without worrying about refrigerating it, feeding it, or otherwise coddling it. Third, it's highly lethal to both people and livestock. Fourth, it doesn't spread from person to person, which can be desirable if you want to perform a controlled strike, and also if you don't want your bioweapon bio-traveling back over to your own bio-population. Now, I realize that this is an incredibly dark subject, and that it should probably be handled with elegance and somber sensitivity, but I am not going to do that. Anthrax explosives, let's go! Now, let's say you are an unscrupulous individual in charge of a war and have in your possession a whole bunch of weaponized anthrax. How would you use it? Well, you could take the sneaky covert route of contaminating food, water, and other supplies with anthrax spores, but that sounds like it would be difficult to do at scale, and as long as you're already committed to war crimes, it would be easier to do with a nerve agent anyway. So, really, you're not thinking big enough. What you need is an E-133 cluster bomb loaded with M61A anthrax bomblets, a weapon reportedly developed by the United States in the 1950s, according to secondhand reports on a small handful of declassified documents. The M61A bomblets would contain anthrax spores in suspension with other stuff that would facilitate its spread through the air, let's say. The nice thing to do with this bomb would be to drop it over livestock farms to seriously impair your enemy's food production. The less nice thing would be to drop it over a major commercial and industrial center and its unsuspecting human population. How devastating this would be is up for debate. Aerosol weapons aren't exactly reliable and depend a lot on weather conditions. I have read estimates that a kilogram of spores could kill 1 million people, and that seems a little on the high side, but possible. But realistically, even if you got a few thousand fatalities and maybe 50 to 100,000 non-lethal infections in a large city, you would be happy, because you are insane, and also because it would trigger a panic and a large-scale evacuation until the area could be decontaminated, effectively shutting down a major industrial or economic hub that belongs to your enemy. And if you happen to capture that city later on in the war, well hey, look at all that intact infrastructure and abandoned real estate. Sure, it needs to be heavily decontaminated, and that is actually kind of hard because of the resiliency of anthrax spores, but you can do it, you little psychopath. I believe in you. You can also ditch the anthrax and keep the toxin. I don't know how effective the purified form of the anthrax toxin is, and I don't want to look it up because there are only so many watch lists a person can be on. You probably don't want to purify the toxin anyway. What you want to do is make some other infectious disease make the toxin or one of its components, thus combining the lethality of anthrax with the desired infectious and environmental tolerance properties of your carrier agent. However, before you eagerly rub your hands and start plotting world domination, I mean, I know I do it too every day, I should warn you that there are two easy counters to weaponized anthrax. The first are cheap antibiotics, which rapidly kill anthrax bacteria in your body, and the second is vaccination. So unless you're fighting the anti-vax wars against the anti-vax side, your anthrax weapon will rapidly lose effectiveness in a prolonged conflict. Of course, there are ways around that, which I won't elaborate on in a public educational video on the internet. If you know, you know, and if you don't, good, honestly good. But from the perspective of the state, biological weapons are costly and unreliable and of limited effectiveness compared to conventional weaponry anyway. Also, they're incredibly illegal thanks to some pesky international laws, although most major political stakeholders maintain biodefense programs, and I would trust a well-funded biodefense program not to make bioweapons like I would trust a well-funded Department of Defense not to start any wars. But enough politics. This is not a politics channel, so let's talk about something completely apolitical: biotourism. Now, tourism here is a euphemism because the internet really does not like the word that it is a euphemism for. In case you're slow, I am going to put the definition of biotourism on screen right now so you can read it for yourself. But the gist is, unlike regular tourism, where you go to visit something for the cultural experience or whatever, biotourists strive to bring the bio to you. On the whole, biotourism is actually quite rare because it requires specialized skills, knowledge, and expensive equipment, as well as ready access to biological agents. All of these things are generally kept under pretty strict supervision and not just handed out to anyone. So it's a high bar. But of all of the biological agents you could theoretically use for your tourism activities, anthrax is one of the more accessible ones. Firstly, it's out there in the soil, so if you were dedicated, you can acquire samples from the environment. Second, it's incredibly easy and inexpensive to grow in a standard bacteria dish, and getting and concentrating the spores from it would also be pretty easy. Actually taking those spores and turning them into a tourism-appropriate weapon would be harder, and what you would do with it from there is an open question. You would have to think like a tourist, and though it may surprise you, I don't spend my days thinking about how to optimally inflict death and destruction upon an unsuspecting civilian population. Thankfully, someone already has, so here are two well-documented historical examples. The first happened in 1993 in Japan, where the Omo Shinrikyo cult released anthrax spores off a Tokyo high-rise. Fortunately for everyone except the cult, the strain of anthrax they used was the Stern live attenuated vaccine strain that lacks anthrax's characteristic defensive capsule and does not cause disease. No fatalities or even infections were reported in the incident. So, like any sensible tourist group, they then switched to chemical weapons and became infamous. But that's a story you can look up on your own. The second happened in 2001 when anthrax spore-laced letters were sent from inside the United States to various members of Congress and press offices. This resulted in 22 infections and 5 fatalities. Notably, the incident is believed to be the work of a sole individual, a disgruntled microbiologist who worked for the US Biodefense Program. Unfortunately, the specifics of how he was able to do this remain murky, and he perished by fluffy pink unicorns prior to his arrest. But it does demonstrate that one bloody-minded individual with the necessary technical skills can do a lot of damage with anthrax, even with limited resources. So, that was fun. Hey, are you worried or anxious about the direction the world is taking? Well, good news for you, because I found a new sponsor. Your mom. Have you called your mom today? Have you told her that you love her? You should. You'll feel better. Seriously. It's gotten so bad that she has to pay strangers on the internet to remind you to call. Is that any way to treat your mother? And also, don't forget to wish your cousin a happy birthday. Their birthday is coming up, and you always forget. This message was brought to you by your mom. So now it's time for our executive summary. Anthrax. Pretty great. Infectiousness, 4 out of 10. Infection requires specific exposure to anthrax spores under pretty specific conditions. Furthermore, direct person-to-person transmission is so vanishingly unlikely that it has never been credibly reported. However, its overall infection strategy is quite effective, otherwise I might have bumped it down even lower. Adaptation, 2 out of 8. Bacillus anthracis is one of the slowest evolving bacteria on the planet, primarily because of its bizarre soil-animal-soil wait 40 years life cycle. This gives it a massive disadvantage compared to its peers for acquiring things like antibiotic or environmental resistance. Widespread antibiotic use in domestic animal industries could still potentially drive adaptation eventually, but even here the risk is lower than for other bacterial pathogens. Unmodified lethality, 8 out of 10. Unmodified lethality asks, just how deadly is this pathogen or disease without any medical intervention? An 8 here feels a little low, but the most common form of anthrax is cutaneous, and it has a 75% survival rate, so we'll average the 6 of cutaneous and the 10 of inhalation anthrax and take an 8. Gameplay. 7 out of 10. Intimidation factor, 9 out of 10. This thing is scary. Just try doing some biotourism with anthrax and watch as everybody loses their shit. Or not. Actually, on second thought, no, please don't do that. Please don't do that. Graphics. The graphics are highly classified. Agents have already been dispatched to your location. Renown, 7 out of 10. Anthrax was the first bacterial pathogen proven to cause disease, and was definitely a superstar of its time. It's made a bit of a comeback recently thanks to biotourism, so while it's down from its historical high of 10 out of 10, most people have probably heard of anthrax. Leave a comment to let me know what else you want rated out of 10. Overall score, I don't know. How would you score anthrax on a contrived out of 10 scoring system? Like, as a pathogen, it's not particularly common or successful, but I guess we'll base it on overall coolness factor and say 6 out of 10.
Oh, look, flashing lights. Maybe the police will take me home.
Oh, Timmy, that's not the police. That's the Russian FSB.
Well, they'll still take me home, right?
Well, they might have, except I called them and told them that you were a biotourist here to collect local anthrax samples for nefarious biotourist purposes.
But I'm just a kid.
Are you now? Or are you a small adult cleverly disguised as a kid?
Definitely a kid.
What I'm saying is, you better start running.
Ah!
Remember, dear viewers, the horrors of biology are just a few clicks away.